So again, thank you for joining us for this first session and for your interest in learning a bit more about the John Monash Foundation and our next round of scholarships for the 2021 round for postgraduate study overseas. So what will we be covering in the webinar today? I hope to convey an overview about our foundation. So I'm going to start from the assumption that anyone joining us might know nothing about the foundation or the scholarship. So we'll sort of be starting from scratch on that front. So we'll give a bit of an overview about the foundation, the 2021 scholarship round, why and how to apply for the scholarships, what it means to be a member of our alumni community, and then generally what you'll need to be preparing for an application should you be interested in going ahead. So for a bit of background on the foundation, we were founded in 2001 and awarded our first cohort of scholars in 2004. As of the most recent cohort of the 2020 scholarships, we now have awarded 202 scholarships to date to leaders across a diverse range of fields, disciplines and industries, and all doing impactful work in their various endeavours for the benefit of Australia. So as we select leaders to undertake postgraduate study overseas, that means that they're doing a PhD or a master's overseas with the support of our scholarship. It's really important to keep in mind that John Monash is not only our foundation namesake and our scholarship namesake, but we're selecting scholars on the basis of their living out this quote here through their impactful pursuits as leaders in their various endeavours. So in essence, it's important to think in considering and preparing an application for the John Monash Scholarship, what that might mean in terms of those leadership qualities in the vein of General Sir John Monash. So a little bit about our scholarship and perhaps what makes us unique in terms of from other prestigious scholarships for postgraduate study. We are an Australian foundation offering impact and leadership-based scholarships to Australian citizens. We are open to individuals from all fields of endeavour, and we're not restricted by age, career stage, or the institution that you would like to study at overseas, as long as you're able to be clear on why it is the best place in the world for you to be. These particularly flexible and unique criteria for our scholarship have resulted in a very unique alumni community. We now have scholars working, collaborating and leading impact across all aspects of society, from medicine, engineering, social entrepreneurship, education, policy, business, law, sociology, political science, public health, AI, defence, urban planning, fine arts, music. I could really go on, but that's just sort of a snapshot of the diversity of the fields that our scholars collaborate and work in. So, should you be interested in applying for the John Monash Scholarship, there are some key criteria that you need to pay attention to. Firstly, you do need to ensure you meet our eligibility criteria. So we do require that all applicants meet these three criteria. The first being that they are an Australian citizen, second being that they have completed or will have completed by the time that they take up their postgraduate study overseas a degree from an Australian institution. It needs to be a full higher education degree. It can be an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree. You just need to have completed a full degree from an Australian institution. And you need to have done so with results that indicate that you'll be able to get into your proposed study overseas. So you'll note that we don't actually have a required GPA for our applicants, but what we do need to see is that when they're putting forward a proposal for a particular master's or PhD abroad, is that they're able to evidence that they'll be a strong applicant to get into that proposed study. So evidencing that you meet the academic requirements is important. And lastly, you need to plan to start a postgraduate degree at an overseas institution the year after applying and being selected for our scholarship. So at the moment, we're talking about the 2021 John Monash Scholarships, and that's because that round will open this year in 2020, and it's for study that will then be taken up the following year. And we also then have some general selection criteria that are based around these points listed at the top of the slide, around what we look for in a strong applicant. So broadly speaking, we're looking for excellence in your field, and that might be professional excellence or academic excellence. It's not sort of so prescriptive, I suppose. Demonstrated leadership ability or potential, and the demonstrated or potential refers to perhaps where you might be at within your career stage, because it would vary a lot depending on where you might be at your stage of you might be you're still in your first undergraduate degree, or you might have been working for 10 or 15 years in industry. So those experiences will be quite diverse, and that's taken into account in the way that we assess our candidates. A vision that will be of benefit to Australia, a very important one. We are looking to support scholars that are undertaking this postgraduate study overseas as a part of a greater vision to do something of benefit for Australia. And then lastly, a study proposal and career plan that evidences how you plan on achieving this vision. So it's sort of bringing all those points together about why the study is important, to equipping you with the skills needed to live out this sort of career plan to achieve this ultimate vision that you see yourself having with your work and career. So what does the scholarship mean for you if you're awarded one? So it is a $70,000 per year, Australian dollars, per year for up to 3 years, a set stipend. And the up to 3 years means that we award scholarships for either 1, 2, or 3 years of funding at the $70,000 per year. And the length of the funding is determined by the length of your proposed study at a full-time study load. So it'll depend on if you're planning on undertaking a master's that is 1 year or 2 years in length, or a 3 year, or a PhD, which will be for the full 3 years. I should note that the funding is capped at 3 years. So even if your proposed study of a PhD exceeds the 3 years, that's fine. You can still apply for the funding. It's just that the funding is capped at 3 years, and the additional years of funding wouldn't be able to come from this scholarship specifically. It is capped at 3 years. And when I say at a full-time study load, that means that you can't apply, for example, for 2 years of funding to support a 1 year master's studied part-time over 2 years. It needs to be that you'll receive 1 year of funding to go with that master's based on the fact that it can be completed in 1 year. So the money is paid to the scholar as a stipend directly, and can be used in the first case for tuition, but in the case that there's funding left over after the tuition is paid, it could be used on living expenses, insurance, and anything else in support of the study overseas. Obviously, as the stipend is a set one, this money might go quite far in some instances, or it might not cover the tuition in other instances. It really depends on the degree and the country and the institution that you're planning on studying at. So in many cases, our scholars are encouraged and supported with seeking additional sources of income to cover any additional expenses. And we allow our scholars to hold other types of small grants and bursaries and fee waivers at the same time as our scholarship. It's generally fine for any other type of funding. It just can't be held with a scholarship that duplicates our funding as the primary tuition scholarship. So that would mean that it's not possible to hold, for example, a John Monash Scholarship with a Rhodes Scholarship or a John Monash Scholarship with a Fulbright Scholarship. But in the case that you're receiving funding direct from the institution that you plan on studying at in the support of a fee waiver, that's fine, or from the institution that you plan on studying at in another scholarship directly from the institution, that's also fine. And then, yeah, other small grants and bursaries are also fine. And of course can be clarified on throughout the process if there's any queries on that point. You also, of course, get access to our foundation network of alumni and extended community, which also sort of relates to this next point of lifelong support, mentoring, and opportunities for collaboration and professional development that come with that network of alumni, and the foundation community of our board directors, selection panelists, supporters, members, and extended sort of John Monash community that we have. So in essence, it obviously a big draw card is likely the funding support for the study, but it certainly goes beyond that and is very much a lifelong community that you then are a part of. We also have some affiliate agreements listed there on screen also. The foundation has a few particular agreements with some institutions overseas that offer further benefits for John Monash scholars that choose to study there, usually in the form of an additional fee waiver or bursary towards study at that institution. And these are all in addition to the set stipend received from the foundation. So that might be of interest to you if you have your sights set on perhaps King's College, IE or Cranfield. I'm happy to clarify on any of those further if you were perhaps considering postgraduate study at any of those institutions. So a bit about how to apply and the selection process for our scholarships. It's quite a lengthy process and goes through 3 main stages. The first being that we take online applications, which open on May 1st and close at 11:59 p.m. on the 14th of July. The applications open through a portal, which is hosted off our website, and details will be put on our applications page of the website as of May 1st to sort of open an application. After the close date, what happens is the applications are assessed online by a team of assessors and shortlisted for our first round of interviews. Our first round of interviews then takes place from mid-August through September. All the dates will be listed on our website shortly, again on that applications page, just in case you were curious about sort of thinking ahead and perhaps seeing if those dates would work with your calendar, because obviously we have very little flexibility with changing them around once they're set. Those are the dates in your particular state or territory or wherever you are in Australia or perhaps overseas. We also have video conferencing panels for candidates who aren't able to get to an interview in person. And there may be some changes to our interview process as required to account for COVID-19 restrictions, which I'll go into a bit more detail about shortly. After the first round interviews, we are shortlisted again for the final and national round of interviews, which are held in both Melbourne and Sydney in late October. And then after the final round of interviews, scholarships are awarded to the individuals, and that will normally happen around late October or early November. This year, it's likely to happen a little bit later. Very likely the sort of first week or so of November, candidates will find out the result of the national interviews. So the purpose of the webinar series in general, this one being quite a broad overview of our process, but particularly parts 2 and 3 later on in our application process will be to assist candidates as they work through that first stage of our selection process, which is the online application opening on May 1st. And as the online application and shortlisting process that follows that online application takes place obviously online, we don't anticipate that there will be any changes made to how we run that first part of the process We do think though, however, we may or may not have to account for some changes to the interview process, which is normally held in person with 5 to 7 panelists in a room plus a candidate, and then plus a representative of the foundation. So it may be that we might have to run those interviews remotely as well. But we'll continue to act on advice from the Australian government and make any changes as required. And we'll evaluate the situation in the lead up to and the close of applications, and we'll keep candidates informed throughout the process on what the interview process will look like this year. But in the meantime, some further detail about our online application. So as mentioned, this will be opening as of the 1st of May, and candidates will then be able to access the online application through a link on our applications page of the website. To apply, you have to create an application login, which is hosted through a portal called Community Force, which essentially when you go to applications page, you'll click a apply now button and it'll take you to make an account for the application portal. Once you've got an account, you can then access, work on, save and edit the application up until that close date of 11:59 p.m. July 14, at which time it has to be submitted to be able to be considered for this round of scholarships. The application portal sort of appears as a variety of tabs on a dashboard for each applicant, with headings such as those listed on screen at the moment, such as general information, where we collect sort of basic things like the name of your degree, the number of years you'd be applying for the scholarship, obviously name, location, so that we're able to best allocate you to a panel if we do get to have them in person, and other sort of general information. That's where you sort of tick off on our 3 main criteria to make sure that you're able to submit an application. So you would need to upload your proof of Australian citizenship as well. Then of course, postgraduate study proposal, a statement on your proposed benefit to Australia, academic summary, which is mostly where you upload any transcripts for study undertaken to date, and opportunity to list any academic award. Work experience, which will include a CV and any sort of professional highlights that you would like to note as well. Leadership, engagement and impact, which is when you can go into some more detail about perhaps the ways in which you've had a positive impact outside of your academic or professional career, whether it be through volunteer work or something to that effect. And then of course, there's a section for your referees to upload their letters of support. The referees section is actually a request section where you put in the details of your 3 nominated referees, and you hit request, and they will then receive details to upload a reference on your behalf, which automatically goes into your application. You'll be able to see if they've submitted it, but you don't get to see what they've submitted. And referees do need to have their references submitted by the close date as well of 11:59 p.m. on July 14th. So I would encourage you to sort of think about the application, whilst these will all appear as very separate aspects on a dashboard. It's important to think of the application as sort of an entire story about yourself that's explaining who you are, but also the impact you're passionate about leading, and why you think this is important to Australia, how you plan on leading and driving this impact, starting with your proposed study. Why is the study an essential part of this? And then how do you plan on taking this forward post completing that study in the medium and long term of your career? What will be the sort of tangible outcomes of your career in terms of leading this impact, and what will it look like? So in essence, it's important to think of it as an entire sort of narrative about yourself, because if the danger is in filling them out as separate tabs, is letting them become a bit disjointed and not finding that clarity in what it is you want to do, and why the study is important to it, and how it's going to really set you up to be able to take this impact forward in the future. So yeah, really think about these various sections and how they are going to help explain this narrative really clearly to your assessors, because they don't view it as separate tabs, they view it as one entire document, which you can also do, and in further parts of the webinars in parts 2 and 3, I'll run through how you can view it as a reviewer would prior to submitting your application. So in preparing your application, it's really important to, of course, do all these things listed on screen. Some of them seem very obvious, but it's vital that you do check them all off. So reading the instructions and checking the criteria, certainly making sure that you meet all the criteria before undertaking an application. It's great to seek guidance where you can. Universities often have wonderful resources available about preparing applications such as these. Or if not, if you're not sort of still at university or connected with university, potentially you could look into the services available to alumni. Elsewise, other resources through your professional life might be helpful as well. Of course, be honest and genuine, and certainly check the deadline, a very important one. Draft and redraft and proofread. If you think about the fact that an online reviewer, and there will be up to 3 or 4 of them reviewing your application at any one stage, all they have to go off is what's written in that application. They don't get to meet you. So ensuring that it's as sort of coherently and clearly put together as possible is very important. And on that note, it's very important to select your referees carefully. You have to have 3 referees that submit their reference letter with your application, and you can have any combination of personal, professional, and academic. We say any combination because we understand that will vary a lot depending on where you're at in your career as to whether that you'd have more academic or more professional. We just don't generally recommend that you have 3 personal referees. It's probably best to have some sort of combination of all 3, or at least 2 of them. And I'd also recommend that you keep in mind that the application is open for 2.5 months. So as of May 1st, and then through to the 14th of July. So it's open for this length of time for a reason, and that's because it takes some time to complete it. So do take as much of that time as possible, and thoroughly proofread and get your 3 references submitted in advance. And when May 1 rolls around, take the time to open up an application so you can start reading through what's those questions and considering your responses. But importantly, sending out the referee request so that they've got as much of that 2.5 months as possible to complete their reference on your behalf. It's you should always speak to them in advance, but certainly you don't want to be sending them a request 24 hours before the due date, as it's not a very difficult platform for them to navigate in terms of what they have to do. It's uploading a letter and completing a very short scaled metric, which is quite sort of simple, but preparing the letter and taking the time to do that, it's good to give your referees some sort of fair heads up in that regard. And ultimately you want to be able to best utilize the time that you've got to submit a coherent and considered proposal. And lastly, I definitely want to point out that it's important, if you have any questions, that you can always get in touch with the foundation, and I'll have my details up on the next slide. If you ever have any questions, you're welcome to send them through to me by email. We're always here to help, and the benefit of our selection being rightly sort of done externally, we administer it, but our selection panelists and reviewers are external volunteers. The benefit is that we get to be here to help you and bring out the best of you in this process. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions at all. So on that note, I'm happy now to start taking any questions and to work through anything that might already be in the chat, or if you'd like to start putting some questions in the chat, I'm happy to work through them. I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes if you've got questions on your mind that you'd like to put in there. And in the meantime, I'll just mention my name's Alexandra and I'm the Scholarships and Alumni Coordinator at the Foundation, and you can see my email address listed up on the screen at the moment. And more information about applications and selection in general will be hosted on our website, which is also listed there. And also make sure to keep an eye out for parts 2 and 3 of our webinar series. Part 2 will be more focused on tips for preparing your application, particularly going through each section. And I'll work off frequently asked questions that I get as they relate to each aspect of the application. So always a good one to sit in on. And then the last session, which will be held a couple of weeks before the deadline, will be a final chance for questions to be asked about the application. Plus, we'll be running a Q&A with a John Monash Scholar so they can give, I suppose, their perspective, having been through the process before. And they can also answer any questions you might have for them about how they found the process and tips they might have, but also, you know, how they've found being a scholar since and what it's meant, you know, for them and being a part of the alumni community as well. So I'll start answering the couple of questions that we have got in there. And as we are recording the session, and I'll send this out to everyone after today's session, I will read out the question because the chat won't be saved, and it will be useful then for listening back to know what the question was. So with the written application, is it a strict requirement that only one institution be listed, or could a couple be listed as opportunities for the applicant? You absolutely can list more than one institution. In fact, there's room for 2 on the application, but we very much encourage you to be considering more than that, because there might be more than 2 perfectly, you know, amazing options for you, depending on what it is you're looking to achieve. For other applicants, it could be very, very niche and specific to one institution overseas. We do suggest that with the proposal that you put forward, it is focused on your first choice institution that you list, or your first and second, depending on how equally weighted they are. But that's not to say that you haven't got options 3 and 4 lined up as well, if that makes sense. So in terms of, could you share examples of the types of metrics that the referees will be asked and how we can prepare the referees? That's a really good question. So in terms of the metrics, it's, as I mentioned, very brief. It's, I think, 5 questions that are based around our core selection criteria that I mentioned earlier. So if they're able to speak to your sort of demonstrated excellence, whether it be academic or professional, leadership and character, your sort of motivations for your postgraduate study, that kind of thing. It's very, very straightforward. And then they're also asked to prepare a 1 to 2 page letter of reference that also speak to those criteria in their sort of capacity of knowing you. And if you're finding I'm not covering off on something clearly enough for any of these questions, feel free to sort of shoot me an email after the session. I'm happy to go through in a bit more detail. So is there any particular weighting of the different selection criteria, or are they equal? At the online application stage, all the selection criteria are weighted equally. So in the case that you intend to change fields in your graduate studies, moving from theoretical into a clinical practice degree, how can I make a strong case for my leadership in my field whilst acknowledging my lack of clinical experience? I think that that's a reasonably sort of common pathway that we might see people coming through with this application. So on that front. It's you don't have to worry about it being something that the reviewers wouldn't think is a logical pathway. I would say that you could make a strong case that you've got a strong theoretical grounding in the discipline, and obviously leadership can look very diverse depending on what sort of discipline you're coming from. So what you're looking to do now is to gain sort of pivot your skills, and that's where the degree, I suppose, comes into it, in sort of setting you on a new trajectory towards different type of leadership. So it's that critical skills gap that you're looking to gain to sort of build your leadership in the field would probably be I suppose the argument or the strong case that you're looking to make there. So the question from Linda: in your experience, when selected scholars apply to universities for alternative funding, such as fee waivers, does possession of a Monash Scholarship tend to rule scholars out? That's a really interesting question. I haven't found that it tends to rule scholars out. We have scholars, lots of scholars that hold multiple funding types in terms of particularly scholarships from their university of study or a fee waiver agreement. Often I think that, if anything, the benefit of receiving the scholarship before applying for your study overseas is that you can then have the support of the foundation in doing that. And with this foundation support, obviously we'll write letters of reference and confirmations of funding. And I think that when a scholar comes with some funding, particularly if looking to go somewhere that is very expensive, and a fee waiver wouldn't account for all of the expenses, or our scholarship wouldn't count for all of the expenses. I think it's if anything, can be quite an attractive feature for a candidate to come with some funding already, if that just means that they're matching funds. So I don't think that it has typically been seen as a negative thing and ruling them out from consideration for other funding, in my experience so far. So the question from Sophie about, is it wise to put down a second option for the application as in a secondary degree? Is it advisable that the same course delivered elsewhere, or could it be a different course provided you justify the narrative? I think it's fine for it to be either, as long as whatever you're listing, both option 1 and 2, are consistent with the goals that you're setting out in the application. So if you're on a set pathway that you want to get into working in a very specific area of public health, and you've put that your top choice is an MPH at Harvard because of X, Y, and Z, and then your second choice is an MPH at Oxford because of it also meets X, Y, and Z, or if you for some reason put an MPP, that could still be fine, but it still needs to be very consistent with the goals you're setting out, and you as long as it still will fill that skills gap that you need to set yourself on that trajectory, then it's fine for it to be a different course, as long as it's consistent with your overall narrative. The question about the PhD in the Netherlands, and unis there pay their PhD students during their studies, and would you be eligible to get the scholarship and the student salary? Very, very lucky situation to be in, because yes, you're still eligible for the John Monash Scholarship in that situation. And it would probably just mean that in that situation, you would be able to complete your studies comfortably and probably use the funding to put towards research projects, as well as travel related to the study and further conferences. So yeah, that's absolutely fine, because it sort of falls into that category of funding directly from the institution of study. And in the case of PhD students in Europe and in the States, in some instances, courses will go for 4 or 5 years. So it is a benefit to have the additional funding in that case. In terms of being overseas at the time of applying, that is absolutely fine, and certainly working abroad and gaining experience abroad in trying to bring leadership back into Australian industries absolutely meets the criteria of impact to benefit Australia, very much so. So no issues on that front. And if you're overseas at the time of applying, as I mentioned, there are interviews that are conducted by video conference for that first round of interviews regardless, because we often have many candidates who might be overseas at that time. It is our preference usually, I say usually knowing that a lot about this year might be unusual given the pandemic that we're all experiencing. It's usually our preference that for the national interviews, we have our candidates interview in person as much as possible, and we will try to support people to get there. But we do know that that may or may not be the case this year if people are overseas, for them to get back into Australia. So we will have video interviews available for both rounds of interviews. And as mentioned, we'll evaluate as required on whether or not we can have any in-person interviews. The question about coming back to Australia after finishing your studies, and I suppose is there an expectation or a requirement? There is no set time requirement on when scholars come back to Australia. It's more, I suppose, given that the application's about, what study you want to go and do to sort of gain skills to come back and bring about an impact for the Australian community. The expectation is that you will have some sort of return date to Australia one day, but it's not so set as you need to be back after finishing your studies in 1 to 5 years. It varies a lot. So a really good question here about what might happen if you're awarded scholarship to study, perhaps in the US, and obviously if you're awarded this year, it would be under the assumption that you're starting up your study in 2021. But what if, when it comes to that, we're still unable to travel overseas due to the COVID-19 restrictions and implications? It's a really good question. I suppose it's one that we just have to continue to evaluate as things continue to change, I suppose. At the moment, we have a whole cohort of 20 scholars who are meant to be departing for their studies overseas, in August, September, and October, and we're having to sort of adjust what we would normally do immensely. We don't tend to do deferrals unless they're in extreme circumstances, and of course, we're in some extreme circumstances. So for many people this year, they may not be able to start their study and put it up. They might have to put it off a year. And if that was to be the same case come next year for scholars awarded in the 2021 cohort, if it's still not advisable to travel at that stage, then we would do the same, evaluate it at that time. And it's not a case of if you're awarded the scholarship and then it's still not possible to travel overseas by the time of undertaking the study. It's not a case of we then take away the scholarship. It would be treated as a deferral. So a question about how is the positive contribution to Australia evaluated? Does it need to be a particularly concrete plan, something less concrete but easily adapted to opportunity? Is that okay given the plans often change? That is a really great question. I think that what's important in terms of laying out that plan for how you plan on bringing about the positive contribution to Australia with your work and future career. What's important is that it's deeply been considered. So we understand that it's impossible for you to have a concrete 30-year plan because it's good to adapt to opportunities that come your way, and that plans do change greatly by circumstance. But what's being evaluated in that particular section is I suppose your dedication and commitment to the end goal in showing that you've put such a level of thought into how it could ultimately play out from undertaking this study and then in the medium and long term years that follow. We don't look it up in 30 years time and see if you've done exactly what you said you're going to be doing at the 15 and 20 years mark. If anything, we've scholars often reflect many years post-study that looking back over their application can be a really interesting thing to do, because whilst at the time of applying, perhaps those plans that they laid out might have changed and adapted and grown into lots of different things that they might not have even considered. What's always good to reflect on is that the end goal that they had is still there for them, and they're still working towards it in various ways. So I think that certainly we understand that it's never going to be concrete, but when you're able to lay out something that's incredibly considered and shows that, in an ideal world at this very moment in time, this is how you can see yourself working towards this goal, and the depth and consideration that's gone into it is what we're looking for. Got another question here about, for a referee, would you recommend including the lab head you have been discussing commencing a PhD with overseas, or who could comment on your promise, their ideas for your time in the lab, or would you suggest academic professional referees who already have worked with you and know you very well? As a general rule, I would always select someone who knows you really well and is able to, really speak to your capacities. And if you think that you're like the head of the lab that you've been discussing the PhD with more broadly can make a really sort of dynamic and important contribution to your application in making comment on your promise and the ideas that you've brought to them in your time in the lab to date, then definitely do that. Or if you think that an academic or professional referee who has probably worked with you in more detail will be able to sort of add a more valuable layer to your application in terms of being able to really delve into your character and your leadership, as well as speaking to those intellectual capacities, then I would go with the second option. But it's certainly, I would always recommend selecting someone that that knows you very well. Happy to answer these last two because we're coming to the end of our hour. So do you have to categorise your referees when you submit them as personal, professional, academic? You don't have to categorise them. You just have to list their name, contact details, and when they submit the reference, they'll be listing it. They'll have to list how they know you. So, but they don't have to select from just one of those three. They have sort of it's like a free text section where they can explain in a few sentences in what capacity they know you. It's just sort of, we recommend, generally speaking, that you don't select three solely personal ones, and we would be able to ascertain that based on how they submit that how do they know you information section. The question on what should I tell my referees to expect, as mentioned earlier, it's certainly a great idea to get in touch with them. You should tell them that you're applying for this specific scholarship, maybe give them a bit of background on the scholarship, and then let them know that what's going to happen is they're going to get an email that's going to come automated from your application, and it comes from the platform itself, so it appears to be from admin at CommunityForce. This will be explained in a bit more detail in the next webinars as well, and when applications are opened, I often get in touch with all applicants who are working on applications with little sort of tips and stuff throughout, just so you've got this in writing too. but it's good to let them know that it comes from an email address that appears like that, and that they will then have an email that says, can you please complete a reference on behalf of John for the John Monash Scholarship, and here's a bit of information about the scholarship and our selection criteria. Please follow this link here to complete your reference. And when they hit the link, it'll take them to their own sort of portal for the application, where they have to fill out their details, such as how they know you, how long they've known you for, that really short metric of 4 or 5 questions that are based around our assessment criteria. And then they upload a letter, which is either in Word or PDF, and then they hit submit. If anything hasn't been submitted correctly, it comes up with an error message explaining what, and then if it's all fine, it'll hit submit, and they'll get a message telling them that it's all done. And my details are also available on that email that they get, and also on the platform at any stage. If they've got any queries, they'll often get in touch with me directly, so I can help walk them through it, and I can also help them submit it if they're having issues by sort of going through the back end of the platform as well. But at any rate, it's all quite straightforward in terms of the instructions. But as mentioned, I'm there to help them if they ever need any assistance. Wonderful. Well, I think we've now gotten through all of the questions that we had in the chat. So I suppose that I'll wrap up by just mentioning again about those next 2 webinars. We'll be sending out details again on our website, on the social media channels, all that sort of thing, to register for those. The next one will be in May, so the application will be open, and it will be a great opportunity to go through those sections of the application in a bit more detail and go through some questions I often get from applicants as they're working through the application. And then the final webinar will be towards the end of June, just so it gives you a few weeks to go before that mid-July due date, to ask any burning questions you might have, and then to have a little chat with a John Monash Scholar who will go over their experience applying and since applying and taking up their study.